Oh, hello friends, hope you're well. Today I'm doing something which I hope to make into a bit of a regular occurrence on the channel, taking a completely random mini from eBay, unseen by myself, and trying to make it look all nice and interesting. So, for my first ever random eBay miniature of the month, that's a working title, I've bought a mystery box containing 3 unseen minis. In the future, I might have friends or family choose a random mini and send it to me, maybe with a theme they select as an extra challenge. But for our first go, I've just selected a mystery box. Anyway, how long to open a tiny little box? There we go. So, inside we have this Pokemon trainer looking woman, this ragged old man, and this well-proportioned little barbarian lady. As a quick first impression, the minis are really sharp. They don't have a great deal of detail, but what they do have is very crisp and very clean. I feel like the 2 ladies should be holding some kind of weapon or something by the way their hands are posed, so I feel a bit cheated these weren't included, but overall these minis aren't bad at all. And as much as I'd love to paint up Bella the breasty barbarian here for you guys, I feel like that's going to be a bit of a not safe for work video, so we'll put her aside for now. This fella here with the walking stick, however, is really speaking to me. I've only seen him for about 30 seconds, but my brain is already seeing visions of him hunched over walking down an old forest path, a weary traveller on the great journey of life. Or just some old geezer out for a walk. He's definitely the one I'll be painting up today, and I think he has so much character that he deserves a little more than just a lick of paint, so we might just see if we can whip up a little display for him too. But first things first, I'll need to mount this guy to make painting a bit easier, so I'm going to try glue in some small pins into the feet, and I'm a bit scared about this because resin can be a bit delicate sometimes, and there's not much space to work with here on the feet. But I drill in a hole as shallowly as possible and then glue in some pins. I get him primed quickly and then it's time to paint. This is probably going to be quite a boring paint scheme, all things considered. This is an old weathered traveller, so I think his clothes need to match that. I'm not 100% sure about the exact paint scheme yet, but I've got out a bunch of browns, greens, a couple of ochre colours and a few others. I'm not sure if I'll be using all of these, but they spoke to me when I thought about our traveller here walking down an old forest path. And after priming him, I realised the whole right side of his body is very torn up and wounded, maybe by a bear, maybe by some feral swamp rats, or maybe he fell onto a large cheese grater repeatedly. Not sure how I missed this beforehand, but we'll have to add a tiny bit of gore to this later. Nothing too extreme though. So the first colour I'll be using today is Lauren Forest for the ruffled shirt he's wearing. And I'm going to take my time and try to be quite neat with this paint job, as often I'll be batch painting or have some deadline to hit, which makes me rush and end up with a bit of a messy miniature. But today I'm in no rush at all, and I only have 1 mini to paint, so I use a nice fresh brush and take my time in picking out the details for each colour. Now I'm giving him some lovely little mustard coloured trousers using some XV88. You dirty old mustard tiger! I don't really use this colour often, but it's actually got surprisingly good coverage. I think I only ended up using 1 coat of this for the trousers in the end, which is pretty good. A little slosh of Mornfang Brown is used here to paint his vest on, and I'm very careful not to get any of this onto the green we've already painted. And as mentioned before, I'm not using any super exciting or bright colours here. I'm trying to think what colours a medieval peasant would have access to, which are likely to be quite drab and plain, and then I'm using those to try and get a look based in reality. This Cantor Blue is probably the most out there colour I use for this mini, which is not saying much really. I use a very small brush to tick all this onto his neck scarf here and make sure I don't get any of this onto the face. This goes on fairly dark when it's dried, but I'll be adding a little highlight of a lighter blue later, which should bring the brightness up a bit and make it pop. For the satchel and staff, one of my favourite ever paints is making its guaranteed at least once per video appearance. Dryad Bark, ladies and gentlemen, let's all give it a massive round of applause and say thank you for always being there for me when I need to add a nice solid dark brown wodge of paint. My hero. And cracking out another of our colour staples, I use some Cadian Flesh Tone to apply the base coat of any bits of visible skin. His face has some old rickety cricket thing going on the side here, so I'll paint that up using this too and then come back later with a little bit of blood. When I got to the arm here, I realised there was more sleeve I hadn't spotted on my first go around, and this guy is just full of surprises. Like when you're a kid and you're locked out of your house because you forgot your key, then you feel something tickle your neck, so you brush it away, and then BAM! It was a wasp, and it stings you, and it really hurts. Surprise. But anyway, I paint those remaining bits of sleeve on, and then move on to our next step. Next, for the facial and head jewel hair, I use a little bit of Mechanica Standard Grey, and you can see this is quite a dark grey, but I'll be lighting this up a lot later to show our wanderer here is of quite a mature age. And usually I suck at painting hair, but I was actually really pleased with how it came out on this mini, so stick around to see that. Or just skip to the end, I guess. And finally, for the little bandage here on the arm, I'm using a splat of some Screaming Skull. Nothing fancy, but it does the job. And once that's dried, all of our base coats are on, so it's time to whip around a few washes. First of all, I give the clothing pieces and the hair a good soaking with some Agrax Surfshade. This brown wash should work well with the muted palette we've used so far to add some shadows and a little bit of depth. Once that's been slathered on, I then give all the fleshy parts a thin coating of Reichland Flesh Shade, just enough to add some definition to it. I think this is my first video on the channel so far where I won't be using Nuln Oil. I'm sorry guys, hopefully you can forgive me. After our washes have had time to dry off, I come in to add a little bit of gore to the oozing wounds our traveller has on his right side. I use some glistening blood for this, and I don't want to go over the top here and add too much. I just want enough to show he's been roughed up a bit on his journey. And I think that is looking pretty good. Not too extreme, but just enough to show he's been in a spot of bother. So now, all that's left is to add a few quick highlights to our mini to finish him off. I want fairly subtle highlights for this chap. I quite like how he's looking already, to be honest, and I just want to push that look slightly further without ruining it, hopefully. So we're going to apply the highlights quite sparingly and using a colour which is not dramatically different from the base coat. To begin with, I add a few scratchy highlights of Scrag Brown to the edges of his little waistcoat vest thing here, and also to the creases on the back. Nothing too fancy, just enough to give it a bit of flavour and help it stand out more. Next, his neck scarf gets a small highlight using some crystal blue on the raised visible sections. This paint is a fair bit brighter than the washed down Cantor blue, so I'm careful to only add a sliver of this here and there. And it's a good thing I poured out all of this paint just to use 1,000th of a milliliter of it. What would that be called? A milliliter? Scientists, get at me. A lovely bit of snotty Nurgling green will be used for the overshirt, and I picked this out the pot like a bogey from my nose. I thin this down and then apply a nice fine-ish highlight to the edges and all the little folds and ridges of the shirt. I applied it a little too heavily in some places, but I'll clean that up later using a little bit more of Lauren Forest, so no worries about that. For the trousers, I was going to use some Towel Light Ochre, but it's looking a bit too light, so I mixed in some XV88 to make sure it doesn't contrast too much with the existing colour. And again, I'm applying this to some of the edges and any little visible ridges or folds. The satchel here is not getting much special treatment either. I'm just using a smidgen of Mornfang Brang around the edges of the straps and adding a couple of scrapes to the main satchel-y body. I also add a few touches of this to his staff, and when it dries, it's super subtle against the dried bark but gives it just enough of a different hue to break the colours up a bit. After that, I add in a drop of Elven Flesh to the Cadian Flesh tone to lighten it up a bit, and then I apply this to the skin. I pick out the nose, cheekbones and some lines of the forehead to give his face a good bit of definition, and then I also pick out the fingers and add a small touch up to the remaining bits of flesh. For our final highlights, I'm using some Ulthuan Grey to add some flecks of colour into the hair and beard. The trick here is to use a sharp brush and apply just a very fine amount of this paint to the individual strands of the sculpt. Often when painting hair, I'll just slap on the highlights wherever or dry brush over a base coat, but by taking my time here to pick out the individual bits of hair, we end up with something which looks pretty good when finished. The eyebrows also get the tiniest little hint of Ulthuan Grey, just to give them that wispy old man untrimmed eyebrow look. And that's all of our highlights added now, so I just need to paint on the eyes. And surprise, surprise, I'm not doing anything outrageously special for the eyes, just a little Ulthuan Grey circle with a black dot on top. And I'm using Ulthuan Grey as it's near enough to white without actually being white, as pure white paints on minis can often look a little bit weird. But yeah, I had an absolute mare with these eyes, I always do. I had to go back and forth a few times to cover up the mistakes I had made, and I was worried they would end up looking like some smudged up old bird poos in his eye sockets. But in the end, they actually looked okay. Not perfectly even, his left eye's a bit bigger than the right, but definitely looking good enough for me. And as a very final last minute touch for our wanderer here, I just wanted to add a little rosiness back into those cheeks. I figure an old wounded traveller is going to be sucking air a bit, so I glaze on a tiny bit of some Carabao Crimson to give them a little rosy glow. And I would say that is finished. You could go further with highlights and shadows and whatever else, but I'm really happy with him as is. Not a very technical paint job by any means, but he's looking pretty clean and tidy. So now I can get started on a little display diorama base thing I've been thinking about, and I'm actually pretty pumped up for this. I've got a pretty clear image in my head of what I'm aiming for, something which should be quite fitting for him, I hope. So I have this random offcut of pine here that I think would be the perfect size for a little mini diorama display base thingy. And I've sanded down the edges so they're a little bit softer, which should look nicer when it's finished. And my first step is to add a chunk of foam on top here, which everything will sit on. I'm planning to add some trees, maybe some bushes or other little bits of vegetation, and some mushrooms here and there. But I'll need to make those first, so I'm going to whiz through that quickly. I won't go into loads of depth with this, as it's basically a whole video in itself. But I wanted to make some old, chunky, gnarly, swampy looking trees for this. So I start by clipping down some wire, which I twiddle together in some random branch-like shapes. Once that's done, I cover the whole thing in hot glue to give it a bit more structure to the trunks and branches. And yes, the trees now look like they're made of a certain bodily fluid, but we'll hide that by applying a mixture of PVA, filler, and random debris to give the trees a nice, rough, barky texture. I was trying to find the video where I saw this method of making trees to credit it. I think it might be a Geek Gaming Scenics video, but I couldn't find it for sure. But yeah, this is a really quick and really cheap way of making trees. Once my bark mixture is applied and dried, I paint the trees up by first giving them a base coat of a pale brown, then dry brushing on an even paler brown-grey mixture, and then one more final dry brush with an even lighter grey colour. The last step in the painting process is to apply a variety of washes to give the surface some natural coloured hues, and then add one more quick dry brush to bring up the rough barky texture. I then glue on some bunches of flock to the branches with some more hot glue and try to hide the glue by pressing down the flock all around it. Then I soak in some watered down PVA to the flock and dust on some different coloured finer flock on top to add a little coloured variation. So now the trees are finished and they're looking pretty enormous compared to our little diorama thing. So I might have messed up on that one, but we'll see. If they look too big when it comes to adding them, I'll just make some more smaller ones. Anyway, onto our little shroomies. For the mushrooms, I crack out some milliput and I make a whole bunch of them in assorted sizes and shapes by sculpting them on top of some pieces of wire. I had added a little loop bit on top of the wire to give the milliput something to cling to, as wet milliput can often slip off a smooth surface. I ended up making way more of these than I would actually need, and I think I got a bit carried away because I just didn't want the milliput to go to waste. I probably won't use all of these for this project though, because otherwise there, won't be much room left for anything else. But anyway, I used some brush and primer to get these primed and then start painting them up in a variety of ways. Some get a single colour of brown, fluorescent green or off-white. Others get some little white spots on top of a red or purple base. The trees and the shrooms are the only bits I actually needed to make, as I have all the other bits already. So now they're done, we can move on to assembling the diorama. Now, I don't want my landscape to be perfectly flat, as that would look unnatural, but I don't want it to be too crazy either. I just want to add some gentle variation to the ground, so I glue down some offcuts of foam here to create a little raised section. I'll be having a small path running through the centre, so I offset the verge to one side where I'll be adding my big old dirty swamp trees later on. I use my sprouting hot glue gun again to build up the terrain a bit, and once that's dry, I come in with a hobby knife to trim it down to look a little bit more organic. And finally, I blast it all over with some wall filler to smooth it over, and I apply this to the sides as well. When that filler is all dried, I give it a quick sanding to smooth down the edges, and we're left with this beauty, which is now ready for painting and flocking and treeing. For my final touches, I locate a spot for each of my trees and then burrow out a little hole for them to sit in. I then apply a mixture of PVA glue and brown paint to the entire diorama to get everything sealed in nicely, ready for painting. When our sealant layer has dried off, I glue in my trees with some hot glue, and they're looking pretty good actually. There's some visible glue around the bottom, but we'll be able to hide that in a moment. And they are quite big, but I don't think they're too big for the diorama. With the trees in, I add a quick little muddy path running through the centre of the diorama using a bit of my homemade mud mixture. And then I apply PVA on all the areas I'll be adding flock and scatter to in a moment. I apply a small amount of some dark green flock to the PVA and then finish it off by adding some fine burnt grass flock on top of that. I let that all dry off and then come back to seal it all in with a mixture of watered down PVA, then scatter on a little more flock and some small stones and sand to add a little bit of variation to the surface, and then one final coat of our fine flocks from before. Now it's tufting time, baby. I whack on a bunch of grass tufts of different shapes and sizes, as well as a few coloured flower tufts here and there. I make sure to add a bunch of these around the bases of the trees especially to hide that visible hot glue, and then I just scatter the rest around where I feel looks natural. I also add a few of these little gamer grass plants, which are pretty fiddly to get into the position you want, but look quite nice once they're done. Some of the leaves do have a bit of a glossy sheen to them, but I dab on a small amount of matte varnish later to dull that down a bit and blend them in with the rest of the scene. And then it's time to add our shroom-oomlies. No real specific method of adding these, I just place them down where I feel looks good and group a few of them up in places. I ended up adding quite a lot of these, and it might look a bit over the top, but I think it still works. This is a fantasy forest path after all, we're not going for realism here necessarily. I give a really quick dry brush to any of the muddy parts to bring out some definition, and then for the very last step I'll be filming, I paint the base black. I'm going to add our little wanderer and do any touch-ups off camera, so you'll have something to look forward to in the reveal, which is coming up right now. So, what do you think, guys? Looking good, or do you hate it? I actually really like this. I was a little unsure of how it would turn out, and there were times throughout this project where I didn't really like how it looked. But now it's finished, I'm feeling pretty satisfied. For a quick recap of what I've done off camera, in case you couldn't tell already, I've added the mini obviously, and I also added this signpost here I made from coffee stirrers. I had written swamp on it, but it didn't look right in the end, so I painted it over and opted for a blank / obscured by dirt and moss signpost instead. I've also removed those fluorescent mushrooms as they looked a bit out of place compared to the rest of the diorama, and replaced them with these two little guys. And lastly, I've taken that black paint all the way up the sides, painting over the brown that was in the foam previously, as I thought this looked a little bit weird being two colours. I think it looks way better in all black. I'm a bit torn about how the base looks. I feel it might have looked a bit better if I just boxed the foam in, instead of adding it on top of the wood. But another part of me also likes the two-tieredness of it. I'll dwell on this a bit longer and may end up ripping it off the wood and boxing it in the future, but for now it will remain as it is. I really enjoyed making this. It was really fun to take a completely random mini and then make quite a spontaneous build around it. I think our wanderer fits in well with the little forest path we've got going on, but I did want to tell a bit more of a story with his wounds, and the signpost pointing towards the swamp was supposed to hint that he had just made it through a pretty dangerous environment, maybe surviving an encounter with a big old dirty swamp rat. I think the lack of writing on the sign maybe detracts from this a bit, but it's not the end of the world. My favourite thing about the diorama is probably the trees. I was worried they would be way too big for the small base, but I think they're actually the perfect size. They've got a really gnarled bark on them, which was surprisingly easy to achieve, and looks really good after soaking up some washes and dry brushing. I'm also really happy with the paint job on our wanderer here. As I mentioned before, it's not especially sophisticated, but it's pretty clean and pretty crisp, which came from being able to take my time on it instead of speeding through 10 or so minis in one go. I hope you've enjoyed watching this, as I definitely enjoyed making it, and I especially enjoyed working on a random miniature I've never seen before and trying to make a little scene which suits him. I'll definitely be making more random eBay miniature videos in the future, aiming to do one of these each month. For my next one, I'm going to have one of my friends choose a random mini and give me a theme to work from also, so look out for that in the near future. Anyway, thanks for watching, see you soon.